The thread between us, a quiet love story of trust and growth. In the quiet streets of a city that never seemed to sleep, there existed a connection, fragile yet powerful, that defined the course of two lives. It was a connection born out of coincidence, sustained by fate, and sealed with a single glance that neither of them had expected. Emma had lived in this city her whole life, walking the cobbled streets and weaving through crowds, always on her way somewhere important, or perhaps somewhere that felt important. Life had a tendency to do that, to make everything feel urgent, even when there was no real reason for it. James, on the other hand, was new to the city. He had moved here just a year ago, driven by ambition, the need to start fresh, and the promise of opportunities that seemed endless. He was the kind of person who stayed on the sidelines, preferring the quiet of his thoughts over the noise of the world. His friends often joked that he was a man of mystery, someone who could go unnoticed in a crowd yet leave an impression on anyone who actually took the time to see him. But despite all his success and the admiration he received from afar, James always felt like something was missing, like there was a part of him hidden deep inside, waiting to be found. The first time they crossed paths was on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, the kind of afternoon that felt like any other. Emma was running errands, her mind racing through the checklist of tasks she needed to complete. She had no idea that the man walking in the opposite direction was about to change everything. As they passed each other, their eyes met for just a fraction of a second, a fleeting moment, but it felt like an eternity. It wasn't love at first sight, not in the traditional sense. But there was something undeniable about the spark that ignited in that instant. It was as if the universe had whispered to them, reminding them that they had been on parallel paths for far too long. Neither of them spoke at first. Emma continued on her way, the moment quickly fading into the background of her busy day. But something in her gut told her that this was different, that this was a beginning. James, too, felt something stir within him, a feeling he couldn't quite name. It wasn't love, it wasn't even infatuation, but it was something, a magnetic pull that made him wonder if he'd somehow met her before. His thoughts lingered on that brief encounter, replaying the exchange in his mind over and over. What was it about her? Why did she feel so familiar? Days passed, and the memory of that encounter began to fade into the ebb and flow of everyday life. Emma found herself thinking about James in fleeting moments, like a dream that lingered just at the edge of her consciousness. She didn't seek him out, didn't look for signs that he was somewhere nearby. Life had a way of distracting her, of pulling her focus back to the mundane, the practical things she had to do. But every now and then, when the wind was just right, or when the city seemed to be holding its breath, she would wonder if she'd ever see him again. James, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling of something unfinished. It wasn't like him to fixate on a passing moment, yet here he was, doing exactly that. The more he tried to forget, the more he found himself searching the crowded streets, his eyes scanning the faces of strangers, hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman who had unknowingly become a part of his thoughts. The coincidence of that one brief interaction was too significant to ignore. It was as though some invisible thread had tied them together, and every time he pulled away, it tugged back at him with quiet insistence. But life, as it often does, had a way of pulling them apart once more. Weeks went by, and the city continued its ceaseless hum, indifferent to the individuals who moved through it. Emma became engrossed in a project at work, a task that demanded her attention and consumed her energy. James, too, threw himself into his career, seeking solace in the familiar comfort of routine. The pull between them, while still present, seemed distant, like a whisper in the wind that could barely be heard over the noise of their own lives. And yet, the universe had a funny way of bringing people back together. It wasn't planned. It wasn't orchestrated. It was simply the natural flow of life, the inevitable clash of two forces that had been drawn toward each other from the start. The next time they met, it was on a rainy afternoon, the kind of day that made everything feel softer, as though the world itself had decided to slow down. Emma was hurrying through the streets, trying to shield herself from the downpour with nothing more than a flimsy umbrella. Her shoes sloshed through the puddles as she muttered under her breath about the weather, wishing for the rain to stop. And then, as if by some cosmic twist of fate, she collided with James once more. This time, there were no fleeting glances, no moment of hesitation. There was only the sudden, inevitable crash of two worlds colliding. "Sorry," she muttered, her umbrella nearly toppling over as she tried to steady herself. James, momentarily stunned, smiled in the way one smiles when meeting an old friend after a long time apart. "It's okay," he said, his voice warm despite the chill in the air. For a moment, they just stood there, both caught off guard by the unexpected meeting. There were no words for the strange familiarity that hung between them, only the shared realization that this wasn't just coincidence. They had been brought together, once more, by the same invisible thread that had first tugged at them. They didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of something neither of them could have anticipated. "Can I walk you somewhere?" James asked, a simple question, but one that carried the weight of something more. It was an offer, not just of a shared umbrella, but of something deeper, a chance to finally explore the connection that had lingered in the background of their lives for far too long. Emma hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I'm headed toward the café on 5th, she said, her voice soft but sure. "That's close," James replied, and together they began walking, side by side, through the rain. Neither of them knew where this journey would lead, but one thing was certain: they were no longer strangers, not in the way they once were. Something had shifted, and they both felt it. As they walked through the rain-soaked streets, they were no longer just two people passing by on their separate paths. They were two souls, drawn together by something greater than either of them could understand, each step taking them closer to a destiny they had only just begun to discover. As Emma and James walked side by side, the rain continued to fall, a soft yet persistent rhythm that echoed the quiet tension between them. The streets were almost empty, save for the occasional passerby huddled under umbrellas or rushing to find shelter. The noise of the city seemed distant now, muted by the steady drizzle. It was as if the world around them had slowed down, giving them the space to finally acknowledge what had been quietly brewing between them since that first glance. Emma, clutching her umbrella tightly, felt the strange familiarity of this moment. It wasn't just the rain or the shared silence, it was something deeper, something she hadn't been able to articulate. She had always been cautious, never one to believe in the magic of random encounters or the idea of fate that so many people talked about. Yet here she was, walking next to James, a man she barely knew, but who felt inexplicably important to her. "So, you're from here?" she asked, breaking the silence, her voice a little more hesitant than she intended. James glanced at her, the warmth of his smile still present, though it seemed a bit more reserved now. "Not exactly. I moved here about a year ago. Before that, I lived in a smaller town just a few hours away." He paused, as if thinking about his next words carefully. "I wasn't sure about the city at first, but it's growing on me. Sometimes I think it's the pace that gets to me. But, well, it's also full of surprises." Emma couldn't help but smile at that. "Surprises, huh?" She tilted her head slightly. "Are you a fan of surprises?" James shrugged, his expression thoughtful. "I guess I'm learning to be. They're not always as bad as they seem, especially when they lead to unexpected meetings." She raised an eyebrow, wondering if he was referring to their first encounter, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she let the subtle humor of his words linger between them, a quiet acknowledgement that, despite the randomness of their meeting, something had begun to take shape. "I'm originally from here," Emma said, her voice a bit more relaxed now. "Born and raised. I know this city like the back of my hand. It's strange sometimes how you can walk down the same street 1,000 times and still see something new. They reached the café on 5th, its warm lights spilling out onto the wet pavement, a welcoming glow in the midst of the dreariness. James pulled open the door for her, and they entered, the familiar scent of coffee and baked goods filling the air. The café was cozy with exposed brick walls, soft jazz music playing in the background, and an assortment of people scattered at the tables, lost in their own worlds. It was the kind of place that felt timeless, where time seemed to slow down the moment you stepped inside. After a brief glance around the room, Emma led the way to a small table near the window, where they could watch the rain continue to fall outside. The warmth of the café enveloped them, and she felt herself relax, a small but noticeable shift in her demeanor. James sat across from her, the quiet tension between them slowly dissipating as they found themselves once again in that space of unspoken understanding. He ordered a black coffee, while Emma opted for a latte. The comfort of the warm drink something familiar in an otherwise unpredictable day. "So, what do you do?" Emma asked after a few moments, her curiosity piqued. It wasn't a question she asked lightly, but there was something about James that made her want to know more. Not just about his job or his background, but about him as a person, the kind of person who would walk through the rain to share a cup of coffee with a stranger. "I work in tech," James replied, his tone steady but unguarded. Software development, mostly. I build applications, sometimes websites. I guess I'm still figuring out exactly what I want to focus on, but it's interesting work." He shifted in his seat as if considering his next words carefully. "What about you?" Emma hesitated, a slight frown crossing her face as she thought about her job. "I work in marketing, mainly digital stuff. Social media, content creation, branding. I like it, but it's busy. Always something new, always something to chase after. Sometimes it feels like I'm running in circles, trying to keep up." James nodded, the hint of empathy in his expression. "I get that. Tech can be like that too. You solve one problem and suddenly there's another. It never really stops." The conversation flowed easily after that, moving from work to casual topics, the kind of things that one discusses with a stranger when the air feels safe enough to share. They talked about their favorite books, the music they liked, and the odd quirks of the city that both of them had grown fond of over the years. Every now and then, their eyes would meet, lingering for just a second too long, but neither of them seemed to mind. The world outside the cafe continued to move on, but in this small corner of it, everything felt suspended, as if they had stepped into a different reality. The longer they sat there, the more Emma found herself drawn to James, to the calm confidence he exuded, the way he spoke with such thoughtfulness and care. There was something about him that made her feel like she could trust him, even though she barely knew him. Perhaps it was the way he listened, or the way his presence seemed to fill the space without overwhelming it. He was the kind of person who made you feel seen, understood, without needing to say much at all. When their cups were empty and the rain showed no signs of stopping, James stood and stretched, glancing at the clock on the wall. "I should probably get going," he said, sounding reluctant to leave. "It's getting late and I have some things to finish up." Emma nodded, surprised at how quickly the time had passed. "Yeah, me too. I have a few things to take care of as well." She smiled, though it was tinged with a bit of regret. "But this was nice. Really nice." James returned her smile, the same warmth in his eyes. "I'm glad. Maybe we could do it again sometime." The question caught her off guard, but it didn't seem strange or out of place. In fact, it felt right. "I'd like that," she said without hesitation, surprising herself with how easy it was to say. As they stood up, the rain continued to fall outside, the world still moving, still unpredictable. But for Emma and James, the thread that had started to weave them together had only grown stronger. Neither of them knew where it would lead, but they were no longer content to let it slip away. They had crossed paths once more, and this time they weren't going to let go. Days passed, and the lingering warmth of their coffee date seemed to stretch out across the days that followed, quietly affecting the rhythms of their lives. Emma found herself thinking about James in moments when she least expected it. When she was sitting at her desk at work, when she was walking to the train, or even when she was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling. The familiarity of his presence, the way his voice had softened when he spoke to her, had imprinted itself onto her thoughts. And she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Her life, once a carefully structured series of routines, had begun to feel different, subtly so. The deadlines at work seemed less urgent, and even the tasks she had once found overwhelming now felt more manageable. It was as if a quiet calm had settled over her, and with it, a growing curiosity. What was it about James? What was it about that moment shared in the café? That feeling that had slipped beneath her skin and taken root in a place she didn't know existed. Emma had always been a bit of a skeptic, a woman who kept her heart locked up tight, buried under layers of logic and practicality. She had always told herself that love, or whatever it was that people called love, was something that happened to other people, to those who were willing to believe in it. She didn't need it, or at least that's what she had told herself for years. But then there was James, and now every time she thought of him, a small, persistent part of her wondered if perhaps she had been wrong all along. James, on the other hand, was equally affected by their encounter. He tried to push the thoughts of Emma to the back of his mind, focusing on his work, keeping busy with projects that demanded his attention. Yet, no matter how hard he tried to concentrate, his mind always seemed to wander back to her. There was something about her that was different from anyone he had met before. She wasn't like the people he usually encountered in his life, people who spoke in polished sentences, who lived in carefully constructed worlds. Emma was real. She was raw, and in her presence, he felt a sense of calm that he hadn't known he needed. He had told himself, after that day in the café, that he wouldn't call her right away. He didn't want to seem too eager. But the more he tried to convince himself to wait, the more his fingers itched to pick up his phone and send her a message. He wanted to know how she was doing, wanted to see if there was a spark between them, or if it had been a fleeting moment. A brief connection that would fade away like so many others. But as the days dragged on, he found himself at a crossroads. Should he be patient? Or should he take a chance and reach out? He had always been a person of action, someone who didn't let opportunities slip by. And yet, he felt a hesitation, a feeling that perhaps he was overthinking this. But one thing he knew for sure was that he couldn't just let this feeling pass without doing something about it. The decision was made for him the next morning when, after a restless night, he woke up with a sudden sense of clarity. He grabbed his phone and, without thinking too much, typed out a simple message. "Hey, I know we've only met once, but I've been thinking about our conversation, and I was wondering if you'd like to meet up again. Maybe for lunch or something. Just let me know. True, James." The moment his thumb hit send, a small rush of panic surged through him. Was it too forward? Too soon? He quickly shook his head, trying to calm his racing thoughts. It was a simple invitation, nothing too much. He had nothing to lose. Within minutes, he had his answer. "Hi, James. That sounds great. I'd love to meet up again. How about Thursday at noon? I know a good place near the park. Let me know if that works for you." Emma. Relief washed over him in an instant. He smiled at the screen, his heart a little lighter. They were on the same page, at least. And just like that, everything that had been uncertain about their connection felt a little more solid, a little more real. Thursday came, and the moment Emma stepped into the café near the park, she felt a rush of excitement mixed with nerves. It wasn't often she went into a meeting with such anticipation, but today was different. James was waiting for her at a table by the window, looking just as calm as he had that first day they met. But there was something else in his expression now. a kind of openness, an invitation to something new. She said as she approached, her voice a bit breathless, though she quickly masked it with a smile. "Hey, Emma," James replied, standing up to greet her. His eyes held a warmth that made her feel as if there was no one else in the world, and for a moment she couldn't quite remember why she'd ever doubted the possibility of something more between them. They exchanged pleasantries as they sat down, their casual conversation flowing easily as it had in the cafe before. The small talk was comfortable, but there was a tension beneath it, a simmering excitement that neither of them dared to speak aloud. It was the kind of connection that couldn't be ignored, even if neither of them knew exactly where it would go. "So," James began, his voice suddenly a little more serious, though still kind. "How have you been? Work keeping you busy?" Emma nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "Yeah, it's been pretty non-stop. But honestly, I've been good. I've started thinking about things a little differently lately, you know? Like the way we get caught up in all the little things, always running after deadlines. But there's more to life than that, isn't there?" James watched her closely, noticing the way her eyes softened when she spoke, how she seemed more relaxed than before. "I know exactly what you mean. It's easy to get caught up in the hustle. Sometimes, we forget to slow down and enjoy the moments. The ones that actually matter, There was something about the way he spoke that resonated with her, like he understood exactly what she was saying without needing any further explanation. She smiled, the warmth of his words sinking into her heart. "Yeah, exactly," she said softly. And meeting people, connecting with them. Sometimes we think it's all about the big things, the career, the achievements, but the little things, the moments that feel real, they're what make it all worthwhile." James leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. "I couldn't agree more. It's the small moments, the unplanned encounters, that change everything." For the next few hours, they continued to talk, the world outside fading as they shared their thoughts, their dreams, and the parts of themselves they'd never shown to anyone else. As they spoke, Emma felt a sense of ease that she hadn't known in a long time. The connection between them, once fragile, was growing stronger, its roots burrowing deeper with each passing minute. By the time the conversation turned toward their futures, they both knew that this wasn't just a fleeting moment. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't some random twist of fate. It was something real, something tangible, something that could change their lives forever. And as the day began to wind down, James looked at Emma with a sense of finality, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I'm really glad we did this," he said quietly. Emma smiled, her heart full. "Me too, James." "Me too." The weeks that followed that afternoon seemed to slip by with the kind of quiet intensity that one feels when life is unexpectedly shifting underfoot. Emma and James continued to meet, their bond growing deeper with each passing day. It was the kind of connection that didn't require constant reaffirmation, but instead bloomed naturally, like the gentle unfolding of a flower. Their time together was spent in simple ways. Long walks in the park, quiet dinners at small cafes, and even moments of stillness that spoke volumes more than words ever could. And with each passing interaction, they became more and more intertwined in each other's lives. Despite their growing closeness, there was an unspoken understanding between them. Neither of them rushed into anything. There were no grand declarations or promises of forever, no frantic urge to define what was happening between them. The relationship, whatever it was allowed to develop slowly, steadily, like a quiet rhythm that neither of them wanted to interrupt. They knew what they had was special, but they were content to let it unfold in its own time, with no pressure. For Emma, it was a revelation. She had never been one to believe in love at first sight or in the idea of fate. Her world had always been built on logic, practicality, and the idea that things happen for reasons we could control. But with James, everything felt different. There was a softness in him that matched her own quiet vulnerability, a peace in his presence that made her feel like she could finally breathe without the weight of the world pressing down on her. He wasn't the kind of person who pushed or demanded anything of her. He simply was, and in that simplicity, there was an undeniable magic. James, too, found himself caught in the current of their connection. He had never been one for long, drawn-out relationships. His past had been filled with fleeting connections, relationships that were often defined by their urgency or their superficiality. But with Emma, everything felt grounded. Her laughter was a balm to the constant hum of his mind, and her thoughts, so different from his own, challenged him in ways he hadn't expected. She made him think, not just about the world, but about his place in it. She made him want to be a better person, even when he wasn't sure what that meant. There was something about her that gave him permission to be real, to show parts of himself that had long been hidden under layers of hesitation. But as the days turned into weeks, a quiet unease began to settle between them. It wasn't something either of them could point to directly, but it was there, an underlying shift in the air. It began with the subtle shift in their conversations, the longer pauses between words, the moments when they both seemed to be reaching for something that wasn't there. It was the kind of unease that comes from realizing that a connection, no matter how deep, can't always remain in a perfect, fragile state forever. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city streets, Emma and James found themselves sitting on a bench in the park, watching the world go by in companionable silence. The autumn air had turned crisp, and the leaves crunched beneath their feet as they walked, the smell of fallen leaves and earth thick in the air. The season was changing, and it felt like everything around them was about to shift as well. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Emma said softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "About life, about what it all means." James glanced at her, his brow furrowing slightly, sensing that there was more to her words than she was letting on. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice steady but gentle. She hesitated, her fingers playing with the hem of her jacket. "I don't know, I guess I've always been so focused on getting to the next thing, achieving something, doing something. But now I feel like I'm standing still, like there's all this potential, all this life ahead of me, but I'm not sure where to go anymore." James nodded slowly, understanding what she meant. It was the kind of feeling he knew all too well, the weight of uncertainty, of not knowing what comes next. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I get that. I've been feeling the same way, but it's hard to admit. You know that we don't have it all figured out." She smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "Exactly. I've spent so much of my life trying to get to a point where everything makes sense, where I have it all together. But now, it feels like I'm losing myself in all of that. And I don't know if it's just me, or if it's something I'm supposed to be doing with someone else." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken emotions. James opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He understood her, understood the feeling of losing oneself in the pursuit of things that ultimately didn't matter. But he also knew something more, something that made his chest tighten at the thought. "You're not alone in that," James said finally, his voice low but reassuring. "I don't know what the answers are, but I do know that whatever's happening between us, whatever this is, I don't want to lose it. I don't want to lose you." Emma turned to face him then, her heart pounding in her chest. His words, so simple yet profound, settled in her like a quiet echo. It was what she had been waiting to hear, though she hadn't known it until now. There was no rush, no pressure. There was just the steady, undeniable truth of the moment. "I don't want to lose you either," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The vulnerability in her words was raw, but it felt like the truth. Her truth. But what happens if we keep growing and we still don't know where we're supposed to be? What if we're only holding on to something because it feels right for now? but it's not enough to keep us going in the long run. James's heart ached at the thought, but he understood her fear. It wasn't easy to open up to someone, to allow yourself to be vulnerable enough to be hurt. But in this moment, as they sat together in the fading light, he knew that what they shared was more than just a fleeting connection. It was something that had the potential to be something real, something lasting. "We don't have to have it all figured out right now," he said, his voice calm and steady, a quiet confidence that Emma found comforting. "We don't have to know what the future holds, but I'm willing to try to see where this goes. With you, if you're willing to." The silence between them grew, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with a sense of possibility, of two people who had discovered something rare in each other and weren't ready to let it slip away. Emma's heart swelled with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could figure this out together. Finally, she nodded, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm willing to try too." And in that moment, with the sun sinking low in the sky and the world continuing to spin around them, Emma and James found themselves standing at the edge of something new. It wasn't a perfect beginning, and there would be challenges ahead, but they were no longer standing still. They were moving forward, together. The thread between them had tightened, stronger now, pulling them toward a future that neither of them could predict, but both were willing to face, side by side. As the days turned into weeks, Emma and James found themselves navigating the subtle complexities of a relationship that had bloomed in the most unexpected of ways. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping declarations of love, just the quiet intimacy of shared moments and honest conversations. They didn't rush things. There was no hurry to define what they were. No need to slap labels on something that, to them, already felt genuine and real. Their time together was still filled with the same ease they had discovered on that first date, long walks through the park, evenings spent at their favorite cafes, and quiet nights where the world outside seemed distant, and all that mattered was the space they occupied together. They learned about each other, bit by bit. Small details at first, like Emma's habit of always arranging her books in alphabetical order, or James's penchant for coffee with just the right amount of foam, not too much and never too little. The little things that make a person unique and somehow indispensable. But despite the comfort that had begun to grow between them, there was still a quiet tension, an undercurrent that neither of them could ignore. The tension was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it became more pronounced as time passed. It wasn't the kind of tension that came from fighting or misunderstanding. It was the kind that comes from realizing that no matter how much you share, no matter how much you open up, there will always be parts of yourself that remain hidden. Parts you might not even fully understand yourself. Emma often found herself lost in thought, staring out the window of her apartment, her mind swirling with questions she couldn't quite answer. What were they really building? Was this just a fleeting connection, one that would fade as quickly as it had come? Or was this something more? Something that had the potential to grow into something lasting, something that could withstand the inevitable storms that life would throw their way. James, too, had his moments of doubt, though he rarely voiced them. He was the kind of person who preferred to deal with his own uncertainties quietly, working through them in his own time. But there were nights when he would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what it was about Emma that felt so right. He had never been one to believe in fate or destiny, but there was something about her that made him question everything he had thought he knew about love and connection. The way she made him feel grounded, understood, even when the world around them was chaotic. But still, he wondered, was he getting ahead of himself? Was he already investing too much in something that wasn't meant to last? The shift in their dynamic wasn't something either of them could have predicted, and it crept up on them slowly, like the changing of the seasons. It wasn't a single event, but rather a series of small moments that began to accumulate. Slight changes in the way they communicated, in the things they chose to say and not say. And as these moments added up, they both began to feel the weight of something unspoken between them. It all came to a head one evening, a few weeks after their last deep conversation in the park. They were sitting in the same café they had visited on their first date, a comfortable silence hanging between them. The café was quieter than usual, with only a few patrons scattered around, and the rain outside painted the world in shades of gray, a perfect reflection of the somber mood that had settled between them. "I've been thinking," Emma said suddenly, breaking the silence, her voice quieter than usual. James looked up from his coffee, sensing the shift in her tone. "About what?" Emma paused, gathering her thoughts before speaking again. "About us. About what we're doing. And where it's going." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and loaded. James felt a slight knot form in his stomach, but he kept his expression neutral, not wanting to jump to conclusions. "We've been spending a lot of time together," Emma continued, her eyes not quite meeting his. "And I can't help but wonder if we're both just avoiding something. You know, like we're caught in this comfortable space, but we're not really talking about the bigger picture." James set his cup down, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "Are you saying you want to talk about the bigger picture?" Emma nodded, her hands fidgeting with the sleeve of her jacket. "I don't know, maybe. It's just, I've been thinking a lot about where I am in life, where I'm going, and what I want. And I think I need to know, before we go any further, if we're on the same page, if this is something real, or if we're just caught up in the moment." James was quiet for a long moment, his mind processing her words. He had sensed the shift in their dynamic, but he hadn't been able to pinpoint what it was. Now, with her words hanging in the air, he realized that they were both standing on the edge of something important, something that would require them to decide, together, whether they were willing to take the next step. "I don't want to waste your time, Emma," James said finally, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "I don't want to be part of something that isn't real, either. But I also don't want to walk away from something that feels important. It's just that I don't know where we're supposed to go from here. We've been taking things one step at a time, and I think we've both been afraid to ask the hard questions. But I'm ready to talk about this, whatever it is." There it was, the conversation they had been avoiding. Emma felt a rush of relief at his words, at the simple fact that he was willing to face the uncertainty with her. She had been afraid to ask the questions that had been nagging at her for weeks, worried that the answers might not align with what she had hoped. But James's words made her realize that they didn't have to have all the answers right now. What mattered was that they were both willing to explore the unknown together. "I don't know where this is going either," Emma said softly, her voice steady now. "But I do know that I don't want to let go of it without trying. I don't want to walk away and wonder what could have been." James reached across the table, his hand brushing against hers in a simple, quiet gesture that spoke volumes more than words ever could. "Then we'll take it one step at a time. Together." Emma nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and hope. It wasn't a perfect solution. There were no guarantees in life, no certainties about what the future held. But in that moment, with James's hand in hers, she knew that she was ready to face whatever came next. For the first time in weeks, the knot in her stomach loosened, and the weight that had been pressing on her shoulders began to lift. She didn't have all the answers, and neither did he. But they had each other, and for now, that was enough. The weeks that followed were filled with small adjustments, shifts in how they approached each other and their relationship. They continued to spend time together, but there was a new openness between them, a willingness to be vulnerable and ask the questions that mattered. And with each conversation, each honest exchange, They grew closer, their bond solidifying in a way that felt more real than anything they had experienced before. They weren't in a rush to define the future, but they were no longer afraid of it either. And with that, they learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes it's not about having everything figured out. It's about being willing to take the first step into the unknown together. As the months went by, Emma and James settled into a rhythm that felt natural but never routine. They both had their moments of doubt, those quiet whispers in the back of their minds that asked, "What if this isn't the one?" But more often than not, those doubts were silenced by the ease with which they fit into each other's lives. Their conversations deepened, the silences became more comfortable, and the time they spent apart felt like a missing piece in an otherwise perfect puzzle. They had talked about the future, cautiously but honestly. Neither of them expected the other to have all the answers, but the willingness to explore the unknown together had become a thread that kept them grounded. They didn't need to know exactly where they were headed as long as they were moving forward with the same intention. To see where this connection, this love, could take them. It was a chilly Friday evening in late autumn when Emma found herself standing in front of James's apartment door, a familiar sense of anticipation filling her chest. They had spent the evening together, sharing dinner and conversation, and now it was time for her to leave for the night. There was a small part of her that always dreaded the goodbyes, the small yet significant pauses in their routine when they had to go back to their separate lives, if only for a few hours. As she knocked gently on his door, her mind wandered back to the night they had met at the café, the rain still fresh in her memory. She hadn't known it then, but that small interaction had been the beginning of something that would change her life in ways she couldn't have predicted. There was a weight to that memory now, one that made her heart ache in the best possible way. She had never imagined she'd find someone who could make her feel so completely understood, someone whose presence felt like home. James opened the door with a smile, his face lighting up when he saw her. "Hey," he greeted her softly, his voice warm. The familiarity of it wrapped around like a blanket, comforting and constant. "Hi," she replied, her voice quieter than usual, the weight of her thoughts apparent in the way her gaze lingered on him. "Everything okay?" James asked, sensing the change in her demeanor. He stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. "You seem a little distant tonight." Emma hesitated for a moment, standing at the threshold of his apartment, feeling the unspoken tension between them. She had been carrying something with her all day, something she had been meaning to say, but the right words had never quite come to her. Now, standing in front of him, it felt like the moment had arrived. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "About us, about how much we've changed since we first met." And James's brow furrowed slightly, and he stepped closer to her, sensing the depth of her words. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, searching for the right way to express what had been weighing on her heart. "I've been reflecting on everything that's happened between us. How we met, how we've built something real, something that feels unshakable. And I've realized that I don't want to take it for granted. I don't want to keep wondering about the future or questioning if this is really what I want. Because, James, I know it is." His expression softened, a mixture of surprise and affection crossing his features. "Emma, No, listen," she interrupted gently, raising a hand to stop him. "I've been holding back. I think part of me was afraid that if I let myself believe in this, in us, I'd end up disappointed. But the more I've gotten to know you, the more I see just how much we've grown together. And I don't want to keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. I want to commit to this, to you, because what we have is more than just a fleeting moment. It's real, James. It's real, and I want to see where it can go. With you. Forever, if you'll have me." James stood still, his heart racing as her words settled in the space between them. For a moment, There was silence, as if the world had stopped spinning just long enough for them to realize how far they had come. He reached out, cupping her face gently in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheeks. "Emma," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to be afraid. I'm here. I've always been here, even when I didn't realize it. I'm not going anywhere." The moment stretched out between them, a quiet understanding passing through the air. Emma closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his touch and the weight of his words. In that simple gesture, she found the reassurance she had been looking for. She was no longer afraid of the future, no longer afraid of what it might bring. Because, in this moment, she knew that whatever happened, they would face it together. When she opened her eyes again, she saw the love in his gaze, quiet but undeniable. He had been through his own doubts, his own fears, but he had never once let go of the thread that connected them. And now, standing before her, he knew that this was what he had been waiting for all along. "I don't need to know what the future holds either," James said softly, his forehead resting gently against hers. "All I need to know is that we're in this together. I'm yours, Emma, and I always will be." The words, so simple yet so powerful, broke through the final walls of uncertainty that had been lingering between them. Emma felt a wave of relief wash over her, her heart lighter than it had been in months. There was no more doubt, no more hesitation. They were finally aligned, no longer bound by the fears of what ifs or could bis. They were choosing each other fully and completely. Without another word, they closed the distance between them, their lips meeting in a kiss that was soft, yet full of everything they had built together. It wasn't a kiss filled with frantic passion or desperation. It was slow, deliberate, and filled with the quiet confidence that came from knowing they were right where they were meant to be. As they pulled away, Emma rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "This is it, isn't it?" she murmured, her voice filled with contentment. "This is it," James replied, his arms wrapped tightly around her. "The beginning of everything." And in that moment, as they stood in the warmth of his apartment, surrounded by the life they had slowly and carefully built together, Emma knew that the thread that had brought them together was stronger than anything that could pull them apart. They had faced their fears, confronted their doubts, and now they were finally ready to embrace the future. Together. The road ahead wasn't clear, and there would be challenges along the way, but for the first time in a long while, Emma felt at peace. The uncertainty that had once plagued her heart was now a distant memory, replaced by the certainty of one thing, that whatever happened, she would always have James by her side. And that, in itself, was enough to face whatever came next. Their love wasn't perfect. It didn't have to be. It was real. It was theirs. And that was more than enough to carry them through whatever the future had in store. Enjoyed the video? Give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell so you never miss an update.